Welcome to Catholic Connection with Teresa Tomeo, keeping you connected to your faith and your world. Teresa tackles the issues of faith and culture, the pro-life message, and media awareness. And now, here's Teresa Tomeo.
On a Thursday, April 23rd, great to be with you in this third week of Easter here on EWTN's Catholic Connection. And we have a show for you this morning, brothers and sisters. I think you are going to really enjoy it because we're spending 2 hours on one topic, and here's why. A few weeks ago, if you recall, before Easter, we sat down live with Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, who is an expert on the shroud, and he's an expert really from a medical perspective, especially as it has to do with the blood on the shroud. Now, there's an exhibit that is going on in Washington, D.C. right now, the JP2 Center, that is actually going to be up for a while, so it's still available if you're in that area. And I found his take on the shroud and the studies that he's done. He's also written a book by Sophia Press. You should pick up. We'll mention that as well. So interesting and profound. And what he says about the way the blood came onto the shroud, which we believe, I know many people believe, I believe, but when I'm using the pronoun we, I'm talking about Dr. Gilbert and myself, I also believe it is the actual burial cloth of our Lord. So he has a very unique perspective. And again, found it so compelling that I asked him, can you come back on and spend some more time with us? And he said, absolutely. So we have 3 segments with him this morning, all about the Shroud of Turin. And I thought it would be really important to revisit it as we move through this Easter season. Now, of course, as believers in the Lord Jesus Christ, no one's going to, quote unquote, forget about the resurrection. But sometimes we can get back into the routine of life a few weeks after Easter and not forget, but maybe not think about the miracles, I should say, associated with our Lord and Savior, especially when it comes to the resurrection. And really listening to someone like a Dr. Lavoie examine it so closely and what he has come to believe and why, I think it will kind of rejuvenate us as we move through this season and help us again remember and say how great thou art and thank God and for the resurrection. So he is the first interview in the 2-hour special show we're doing this morning. And then hold on to your hats and your seats. It's going to be an amazing ride in the second hour on EWTN Radio Extra because we have the one, the only Father Robert Spitzer. Now, there is a new museum dedicated to the shroud that opened up in Orange, California, and the information that Father Spitzer has gathered over the years about the Shroud of Turin, it will blow your mind. I mean, you are going to listen to him and hear so much detail. And this is why it's so important to pray about this and to think about what our Lord did and what happened in the tomb. How instantaneously, but how powerfully it happened, and what caused this image to be placed on the Shroud of Turin. How could it happen? So I hope you'll enjoy it. We have, again, Dr. Gilbert Lavoie and Father Robert Spitzer. Of course, you know Father Robert Spitzer, of course, from EWTN's Robert Spitzer's Universe, hosted by Doug Keck, our President Emeritus. His many appearances on EWTN, and, of course, his many books and his work, of course, out in California and across the country around the world. A great apologist, teacher, a wonderful Jesuit priest, and we have him on today for us. We actually re-airing the interview that we did with him a few weeks ago when he was at the headquarters of EWTN taping some programs with Doug and with Father Mitch. So again, we thought we would put these two together and take a very, very deep dive into the Shroud of Turin as we continue to move through the Easter season. So that's a show for a Thursday. It's Thursday, April 23rd. Let's take a look at the forecast and see what's happening as we get closer to the weekend. They're still talking about that Pacific storm system that's continuing to bring low elevation rain and mountain snow to parts of the west, and it could be with us for today as well. And also looking at some snow in the higher elevation areas of the Sierra Nevada. And the system is also bringing strong winds to the Intermountain West, the Rockies, and the Plains, and will create some critical fire weather conditions for the high plains that will continue for a few days, possibly into the weekend. That is a look at the forecast and, of course, the rundown, as we say on a Thursday morning. Let's get started with the news here on April 23rd on EWTN. Iran attacking 3 ships in the Strait of Hormuz. It comes after the president announced an extension of the ceasefire earlier this week and said it was so Iran's leaders can come to the U.S. with a unified proposal. It's also after U.S. forces seized an Iranian ship and boarded the oil tanker Unclear if a second round of in-person peace talks will happen after the president or vice president, J.D. Vance, stayed in Washington instead of heading to Pakistan yesterday. And Pope Leo on Wednesday urging Catholics in Central Africa to help shape the nation's future, saying there is a need for Christians to take the destiny of Equatorial Guinea into their own hands. The second day of the Holy Father's apostolic journey in the country, opening with the celebration of Mass at the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception in Mongomo. The Immaculate Virgin Mary is patroness of that area. The basilica, by the way, is the largest religious building in Central Africa and the second largest basilica on the continent. Equatorial Guinea is his final stop of his 10-day trip that began in Algeria and included stops in Cameroon and Angola. After a ceremony at Malbalo International Airport, he is set to depart for Rome later this evening and landing at Fiumicino International Airport. Israeli defense forces are helping a Catholic village in southern Lebanon replace a crucifix that one of its soldiers destroyed with a sledgehammer and punish 2 soldiers who took part in that desecration. EWTNnews.com reporting the Israeli military announcing in a recent post on X, in full coordination, they said, with the local community in southern Lebanon, the damaged statue was replaced by IDF troops. They added that the Northern Command did work to coordinate the replacement of the statue from the moment it received the report of the incident, and added the IDF expresses deep regret over the incident and is working to ensure it does not happen again in the future. The response, as EWTN News explains, comes after a photo circulated on social media showing an Israeli soldier striking the face of Christ on a damaged crucifix with a sledgehammer. Cardinal Pier Battista Pizzaballa, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, calling the act a grave affront to the Christian faith. A new automation system for the telescope at the Holy See's Astronomical Observatory in Arizona will allow students from Jesuit universities to use it remotely for scientific research. EWTN News explaining Mount Graham in Arizona is home to the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, one of the most important observatories managed by the Vatican. Astronomers will now be able to operate the telescope remotely without the need to be physically present on the mountain. In fact, astronomers in the Vatican Observatory at Castel Gandolfo in Italy are already making use of the new feature. And a Texas law that requires public schools to post the 10 Commandments has now been upheld by a federal court. That happened earlier this week, and the reactions are still coming in. A victory for conservative activists who feel the Bible verse should be part of curriculum.
Acknowledging the historical foundations of our laws is not only permissible, it is fully consistent with the Constitution.
And Jonathan Sines with the group Texas Values saying the ruling clears the way for donated posters to be hung in all classrooms. In its opinion released earlier this week, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals saying the state law does not punish anyone who rejects the 10 Commandments, regardless of the reason. And Rory O'Neill tells us if you're not happy with Congress, well, you're not alone.
Acknowledging the historical foundations of our laws is not only permissible, it is fully consistent with the Constitution.
A new report showing rampant sexual misconduct, meanwhile, taking place in politics. The National Women's Defense League earlier this week releasing its first ever comprehensive report on sexual misconduct in Congress, showing over the last 20 years, 49 members of Congress have been accused of some form of sexual misconduct, including 30 who are accused of workplace sexual harassment. Mark Mayfield tells us Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum is now calling for answers after reports that 2 American CIA officers died in a car accident coming back from a counter-narcotics operation in her country.
The Washington Post was the first to report the crash in northern Chihuahua State that also killed 2 Mexican officials. Reports say the CIA officers were working with Mexican officials to dismantle a drug lab. Sheinbaum said her office was unaware of the collaboration, and Mexican prosecutors are investigating whether the operation violated national security. I'm Mark Mayfield.
President Trump's pick to be the next Federal Reserve Chair says he'd be strictly independent on monetary policy if he's confirmed to that post. Tori Waterman explains that Kevin Warsh made the comment during a testy Senate Banking Committee hearing on Tuesday.
Senator Elizabeth Warren called Warsh President Trump's chosen sock puppet, claiming he's flipped on being an inflation hawk to appeal to Trump. Hanging over Warsh's nomination is the DOJ's criminal investigation into the current Fed chair, Jerome Powell.
Republican Tom Tillis, who sits on the Senate Banking Committee, meanwhile, has said he will block attempts to confirm a new Fed chair until that investigation into Powell's handling of renovations at the Federal Reserve headquarters is dropped. Warsh was a member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors from 2006 to 2011, must get a majority yes vote in the committee before his confirmation goes to the full Senate. Florida's Attorney General is launching a criminal investigation into OpenAI. James Uthmeyer said his office is also issuing subpoenas to the AI company to seek information on how it approaches a user's threat of harm to themselves or others. The subpoena will also request information on policies and internal training materials regarding OpenAI's cooperation with law enforcement. And we have another story for you that's rather interesting. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has filed a lawsuit against the Open Stories Foundation over its Mormon Stories podcast.
The church alleges trademark and copyright violations, claiming the use of the word Mormon along with similar branding and design elements could confuse the public into thinking the podcast is officially affiliated. The suit also names podcast creator John P. DeLynn. He disputes the claims, saying he's used the name for more than 20 years and has made changes to address concerns. DeLynn also argues the podcast clearly states it is not affiliated with the church as the case moves forward. I'm Jim Roop.
JFK Airport is unveiling its updated Terminal 8 as it makes plans for more renovations. A Port Authority President, Catherine Garcia, helping to cut the ribbon this week on 60 new food and retail options to choose from following Terminal 8's $525 million makeover. But she says there's more to be done to improve the airport's reputation.
Ranked by many travel organizations as the worst in the country. And they were not wrong.
The airport is also allocating $9.5 billion to overhaul Terminal 1 and more than $4 billion to redo Terminal 6. There's also another $4 billion going toward infrastructure projects to address road work in the area. And dry conditions and gusty winds are triggering dozens of wildfires across Georgia. The Georgia Forestry Commission saying they've responded to nearly 100 wildfires since Saturday and that several are still burning. The Pineland Road fire in southern Georgia has burned over 16,000 acres and is only 10% contained. State emergency officials have issued mandatory evacuations for many living in the area. And Mark Mayfield explains rare literary classics from the likes of John Keats, James Joyce, and others are back home to their rightful owners on New York's Long Island.
17 books were stolen from the Green Tree Estate in Manhasset between 1982 and 1989. The books were returned this week to the heirs of John Hay Whitney and Betsy Whitney after someone tried to sell them to a pair of Manhattan dealers earlier this year. The rare collection is valued at an estimated $3 million. I'm Mark Mayfield.
And finally in our news, on a Thursday, April 23rd, Walt Disney World raising ticket prices. The Florida theme park rolling out its pricing through October of next year. And the most expensive one-day ticket will cost $219 a person on President Day weekend. Peak ticket prices this year reaching $209. Out west, Disneyland's peak ticket has reached $224. Disney offering some discounts to try to draw visitors during the summer months, but with stripped-back perks. It is a Thursday morning. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Catholic Connection. We appreciate your listenership here on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. We are in the Easter season. What a glorious time of year on the liturgical calendar. And I thought it would be great to revisit this topic of the Shroud of Turin with an expert. He's written a beautiful book, which was published by our friends at Sophia, and the book is called The Shroud of Jesus and the Sign God Ingeniously Concealed. It was published back in 2023, again by Sophia Institute Press. We've had this beautiful special exhibit going on in Washington at the JP2 Center, and it's just a phenomenal, not only exhibit, but the book is excellent, and the expertise of our guest, Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, who knows so much about the Shroud, and we're going to dive into that, doing 3 segments. Its entire first hour is going to be all about the Shroud of Turin. Now, the Shroud has not been exposed for some time yet. Of course, the Church has to determine when it's going to be brought out for public veneration again. In recent years, it's been exposed twice. If it ever happens again, I would highly encourage you to think about getting to Torino, Italy, where it is kept at St. John the Baptist Church. It is just an amazing thing to see in person, and I do believe, it's my personal opinion, the Church doesn't say whether it is actually the burial cloth of our Lord, doesn't give a definitive answer on that. It allows us to come and see and make up our minds. But I've seen it twice, Deacon Dom and I, and I'm totally convinced, as is our guest, Dr. Lavoie, this is indeed the cloth that was around the body of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us. Happy Easter. We're in the Easter season. I know there's so many things you want to discuss this morning that we didn't get to the last time around, but what would you like to start with? What about something that we know as the hidden image of the shroud? And thank you for joining us, by the way.
You know, it's really amazing. One of the most phenomenal things about this whole thing is that, indeed, it's a hidden image. Until 1898, when the first photograph of the shroud was done, we just saw it as a very hazy outline of a man, of course, with the blood marks that we see, which are consistent with what we read about in the Gospel of John, because all the blood marks that are on the cloth are exactly like what we read about in John's Gospel. But that first photograph was taken, and when Secunda Pio went to his dark room, there he saw on his negative plate the positive image of the man. So what was on the original cloth is the negative image of a man. And the whole big question is, how could a negative image get onto a cloth, an ancient cloth, when photography was only invented in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century. So what we have is this phenomena that really rang around the world. And it's interesting when you look at it, you see a positive image in the negative, and the blood itself is negative. So what we have on the cloth itself is actual blood. So we see, so when you look at the cloth, the original cloth, we see the negative image of a man and the positive blood of our Lord. It's amazing. So with that, that's probably the best instrument really showing us the image of the shroud. And when we talk about images, it's very interesting to note that when you look at the Bible, John never really talks about an image, and so that's been a criticism of the fact that maybe it didn't exist at that time. However, people in the work that we did, we discovered that if you read Josephus and so forth, that we know that it was not permitted for people to make either an image of God or indeed of man. And that's what we have here on the shroud, is an image of man. So John, being a Jew of that time and understanding the Torah, really understood that it would be really impossible for him to say anything about the image, because he knew that if he did, it would be, and that it was considered an object of idolatry, it would be destroyed. So he had to really talk about this in a very different way, in secretive way, and which we can get into a bit later. So I think that one of the things as a physician that I started to think in terms of, I'd like to study the blood that's on the cloth. And but before I got started, I said, I'd like to know a little bit about how the Jews bury their dead. And so my wife and I took about a year and a half and studied this subject. And at the time, there was a big controversy that was in the early 80s. And what it was is that, and in fact, it had been going on since for the last 80 years, since the discovery of the positive image of the shroud through photography. That what you see on the cloth is you see a man who has blood all over his body. Yet in John it says that he was buried according to the Jewish custom. And so the Jewish custom, the normal Jewish custom was that if you would wash the body prior to burial. So there was this group that said this can't be the body of Jesus because he has blood all over his body and he wasn't washed, and he was buried according to the Jewish custom. And the other people said, well, Sabbath was imminent, so therefore they didn't have time to wash the body. They simply buried him according to the Jewish custom, except for washing the body. Well, this argument went on, but when I started to study this, I was very fortunate to discover that there's an exception to washing the body, and that exception is that if a man dies a violent death, the blood is not washed from the body, but he's simply wrapped in a sheet and buried. And that blood is very, very important. We have to think in terms, when we look at the blood of the man of the shroud, we're looking at the last flows of the blood. In other words, the blood, most of the blood that was on his body dried over time, and it's the last blood flows that were on his body that actually transferred over to the cloth. And so that blood, the Jews were very interested in that blood, and that they would consider that the blood, the life's blood. And in other words, they quantitated and qualitated blood. We learned that this went all the way back to the Mishnah, and we studied that, and we discovered that at that time, and particularly at the time of Jesus, that was known and understood. And what it was is that they qualitated it. They said it had to be blood that flowed at the time of death, and they quantitated it. It had to be a quarter of a log of blood. Now, a log of blood is the contents of 6 eggs, and a quarter of a log would be the contents of an egg and a half, like a small cup of wine. And that sort of brings thoughts to your mind when you think in those terms. So that amount of blood was considered life blood, and that blood was also considered the blood of atonement. In other words, the blood of atonement for sins. Mm-hmm. So what we have on the man of the shroud was blood that flowed during life, and blood that flowed at the very moment of death, and that was considered mingled blood, and that also had to be buried with the body. So the body was not washed. So what we're seeing on the shroud is the blood of Christ, his blood of atonement, the last blood flows of his, which is amazing.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you, Doctor, not to interrupt, but given the fact that he was beaten and tortured so severely, I mean, you're the medical expert, but could the body continue to bleed given the extent of his wounds even after he was dead?
No.
No?
Not really. Once the heart stops,
okay.
You don't have the pressure.
So
you
the
need
blood
a heart
flow
beating
doesn't. Yeah. Okay.
If you had blood, let's carry that out. I think it's a good question. If you carry that out further and you'd have blood oozing, you wouldn't have the nice, neat clots that you have, the nice, neat transfers that you see. You wouldn't have that. You'd just have a lot of mess, just a lot of blood all over the place. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that's not the case. Now regarding the transfer of blood, that's what fascinated me when I first started that. And we basically have to give credit for these 3.
Okay, hold that thought. Here comes the music already. I can't believe we're already done with our first segment. I knew this would happen because there's so much great information you're sharing with us. We're doing a deep dive into the Shroud of Turin with an expert, one of the most foremost experts on this topic of the Shroud, Dr. Gilbert Lavoie. His most recent book, The Shroud of Jesus and the Sign John Ingeniously Concealed. We'll be right back. Having a fascinating conversation this Easter season with, I believe, one of the reminders that the Lord has left us. As I said in the top of the program with our guest, Dr. Lavoie, an expert on the Shroud. He's written a beautiful book published by Sophia, The Shroud of Jesus and the Sign John Ingeniously Concealed. I do believe that the Lord invites us, come and see, take a look at this, take a look at the Shroud, read about it, learn about it. So that's why I wanted to have Dr. Lavoie on, really just to dive into this, as I just said, more deeply. And we were talking about this whole fascinating aspect of the transfer of blood. Okay, so what is your understanding of how the blood was transferred to the Shroud? You started to discuss it, and we took a quick break, and now we're back. So please, the floor is yours.
Sure. What you see in the cloth, there's about 3 different types of blood in a sense. Not types, but origins of blood, I should say. And Barbet, actually, Dr. Barbet, who wrote a book, he was a French surgeon. It's the first book I read back when I was in college. Anyway, he did a beautiful job. There's really, we look at, first of all, the scourge marks. they're what we call excoriations, like you scrape your knee as a kid. And so it remains oozy and serumy and bloody for quite a while. And it's just the serum, just oozes out, and it doesn't dry right away. It takes hours and hours for it to really dry up. And so that's the scourge mark. And then there's the post-mortem blood. That's the blood that took place after he died. In other words, that's just spilled out of wounds. And we have two major post-mortem blood areas, and one of them is at the lower back. And that blood spilled out of the chest wound, and that's sort of a mixture of blood and water. I should say water. It looks like water, but it's actually a pleural fluid from his lungs. And so that's at the lower back. And then you see the blood. There's an area of blood at the feet. This is on the back of the cloth also, which also just drained from the wound of the foot. And then we have clotted blood. And this clotted blood is blood that pours out from the wounds, for example, the many puncture wounds of the scalp head area. And then we have the wounds at the side, and we have the wounds at the wrists and the feet. That's clotted blood that pours out. And what I mean by clotted blood, we've all experienced that. You have a cut, and with that, within a few minutes, up to 10 minutes, you have clotting of that blood. And then at 30 minutes, the blood, those clots constrict, and they push out serum. Now, when I was first doing this study, I decided I wanted to see how these because nobody had really done the transfers. Barbe talked about that these are mirror images of blood clots, but never did any experiments. But I did the experiments, and you can find them in my book, very clearly placed out. And so, what happens is that if you do this on a horizontal table, when that serum oozes out and then you try to do a transfer, you get a very sloppy transfer and not a neat. What I learned is that, of course, the man of the shroud didn't die in the position of lying down and so forth. He was actually hanging from a cross, and that blood actually, when the clots formed and that serum oozed out, it just dripped away from those clots and left you with a nice jelly-like clot. And so that's what transferred. So when I would place the cloth on top of these jelly-like clots, you first see sort of a little yellow serum coming from it because there was still some in that, and that's what retained its moisture. And then the blood cells and so forth came through, and it read and it soaked right through. And it just took seconds for it to soak right through. And then so when the main thing about that is that I discovered, at least at room temperature, that those blood clots would remain moist for at least an hour, maybe an hour and 15 minutes. And if there was more moisture added, it would be longer, maybe an hour and a half or whatever. So and moisture could come from a body that is sweating and so forth, as his body could have very well been because of the work, because of the situation that he died in. So so those transfers indeed took place, and they tell us that really these things. It tells us that when that you get nice, neat transfers when you have a person who dies in the vertical position rather than the horizontal position. That's the neatness why we had these nice, neat transfers. And then they basically, and I talked to you about how it's soaked into the cloth. And if you take a penny, once it dries, it doesn't change the clot itself. It just stays there, and it's really stuck in the cloth itself. In fact, it goes right to the other side. In fact, the men who actually buried Christ, they saw those blood marks soak into the cloth. They could see them because it just took that many minutes. Within a minute, it was all done. In other words, all that moisture and blood went into the cloth. Anyway, the other thing is that these clots are not disturbed, and the reason why they're not disturbed is because they should have been disturbed, because the clots are very fragile, when they're moist, indicates a very strong possibility that this was a Jewish burial, because only the Jews would be concerned with life's blood and wouldn't want to disturb it at all. So they would take great care in taking the body down, not to disturb the clots. And then finally, in thinking in terms of what we talked about, the blood of atonement, is that what we have on this cloth, again, as I mentioned earlier, is that this is blood that we see is the blood, the mingled blood, the blood of atonement, the blood of atonement for our sins that we actually see on the shroud of Jesus, which is just quite moving and in many, many ways.
So in terms of, let me just ask you, I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm just curious, in terms of you saying that this is, and you have this, by the way, on your beautiful website, shroudstudies.org, that he's upright, lifted up as in midair. That is different than what many other people have said about the Shroud of Turin and how the image was transferred, correct?
That's correct, exactly. And we can definitely, if you'd like me to cover that right now, I'll be glad to do that.
Well, we have about 2 minutes until the break, but I just think it's really interesting. Now, what about the hands? If it was upright, would the hands still be in that position though, or would they drop to the side?
Well, there's a lot to be said about that. The hands could have been basically tied together at the thumbs.
Yeah, that's what I was
Some
wondering.
people are
Yeah,
talking about that, or they just they're clenched in a certain way. There's certainly a certain amount of rigor mortis was involved in the body as well. However, a lot of that it still remained, at the time of the resurrection. But I think that there's three parts to that understanding that the man is upright, and probably we may have to cover that in our next session. But maybe I have time to first of all let our audience know that he did die in a crucified position, and I'd like to share with you something about the blood marks to tell us that for sure.
Sure. Sure. Let's do that when we come back. Already segment number 2. I knew this would go by so quickly. Fascinating and important conversation this Easter season about the Shroud of Turin, which is kept at the, of course, beautiful Cathedral in Torino, St. John the Baptist. It is not available at this time for veneration, but you can go and see the chapel where it's held, and there's also the tomb of St. Pier Giorgio Frassati in that same church if you're interested. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're having a fascinating and important conversation in this Easter season, and actually year-round, about the Shroud of Turin. This never goes out of style or out of date, because it's something that I think was left behind. Us to, as I said earlier, come and see. Dr. Gilbert Lavoie is giving us a lot of insight into his amazing research that he has done on the Shroud of Turin. He has a number of places you can go to get information about the Shroud and his work. Shroudstudies.org is one, and then also shroudphotos.com would be the second, and links to his book are, of course, at the shroudstudies.org. The book is from Sophia, The Shroud of Jesus and the Sign John Ingeniously Concealed, which was published a few years ago by her friends at Sophia Press. And also wanted to let you know that the exhibit in Washington at the JP2 Center will go until the end of May. So you have about another month, about another 4 weeks to see it. And then there is a permanent display at Ave Maria University down in Florida. So, Doctor, this whole idea of the blood is just fascinating, how it was transferred, and the really very, very intricate study you did of this, right?
It's fascinating. In fact, I was sort of a skeptic when I first started. And I can tell you what I'm going to talk about next is where I no longer I was no longer a skeptic and realized it was truly a crucified man in this cloth. And I'd like to talk about this off-image blood mark at the left elbow of the man of the shroud. Actually, it's the right elbow of the man that was under the cloth, but it's at the left elbow of the man of the shroud, and because it's a mirror image. Anyway, it turns out that this off-image blood mark, nobody knew about it at the left elbow. And to make a long story short, we discovered that the arm to the let's put it this way, the left arm, which is the person's left arm, it was not of the cloth. The left arm, you're looking at the at a man. is stretched out as if he's crucified, but the other arm, he's actually bent over toward the right, and the right arm is sort of bent at a 90-degree angle. So the blood from the wrist came down straight down the arm, the forearm, and then at the bend of the elbow, it went around to the back of the arm and then cooled and dripped off the body. And we discovered that's how that image came. And we're talking about a blood mark that's off image. So it's like you wrap it around the person. So basically, it's as if you're washing your hands and you stand up holding your hands up and you say, "Can you hand me a towel?" And you feel that water dripping down around your elbow and down to the floor. I think you're probably familiar with that. And everybody that shaves, all the guys are very familiar when they shave. They have that sense. I do it every morning. Anyway, it turns out that that this tells you several things. It tells you that he definitely died in the crucified position, and that the blood marks are simply a contact process, cloth touching the moist blood clots, as we already discussed. But that the image is not a contact process because it touches the side of the arm, and there's no image there. So therefore, we know that there's a three-dimensional man on the cloth. All the other blood marks tell you it's height and width, but this tells you the third dimension, depth. And one has to really go into the book to see the photographs in order to really appreciate what we're really talking about here. But the other thing is that it tells you the image is not a contact, basically not a contact process. That's very important because the cloth touched the back of the arm, and yet there's no image there. And finally, it tells you that it's not a natural event because natural events are ubiquitous, and if it's going to happen on the front of the arm, it should happen on the side of the arm, and it doesn't. So it's not a natural event, plus the fact that for these last 125 years, there's no natural event that could explain the shroud image anyway. So I think that we're running sort of low on time, and you had asked me in the last section about the upright man of the shroud,
right.
And I'd like to talk to you about that, if I may.
Sure, please, go ahead.
And it turns out that I believed that the man of the shroud, the blood marks of the man of the shroud are consistent with a man that was crucified in the upright position, and then he was laid on his back on one end of the cloth, and the other end was placed over his body. And so I believe that he was lying down forever, most of my adult life. And but all of a sudden, I actually discovered, just simply by accident, I took a photograph of the man when I was doing a study on the face and so forth. And I took a photograph of my volunteer when he was lying down, a bearded man. And I was very excited about looking at that photograph because that was back in the 80s when we still had a positive and negative image. You know, they give you a black and white film, and you'd have a negative in the film along with the positive image. And so I was looking at these negative images. When I looked at the negative image of my volunteer, it didn't look at all like the man of the shroud. And what it was is that the face is bland. We know, in other words, when a person lies down, light comes from above, and there are no shadows cast on the face or the body. But if a person is upright, there is shadows that are cast on a person. It so happens that I took the same picture, the picture of the same volunteer when he was upright and sitting at my dining room table, and that one matched the light areas that you see on the face of the original negative of the shroud. Mm-hmm. So in other words, the light, through light itself, the creator of the shroud tells us that the light that falls on the man's body, and that's not only the face but the chest and hands, is that of an upright man. So then I said, is there anything else that's that was, in fact, when I saw that, it was a sort of a moment of, it was an epiphany for me, because now I saw this man as an upright man rather than one lying down. We're just talking about the anatomy of the body now.
Right.
As opposed to the blood marks. Okay, the blood marks were consistent with somebody lying down, but the anatomy of the shadows of the face and body were that of an upright man. And so then I looked again and I saw, my gosh, look at the hair. The hair actually falls right down to the shoulders and down the back, just as if a man was upright. And if you were in my office, as I was for many, many times, helping people lie down on a table, with long hair, sticky hair, whatever hair, it all falls down and it's also flattened. So we have gravity of the hair that tells us that he is upright. So we have light that tells he's upright and gravity. And gravity doesn't only affect hair, but it also affects body form. So if you were, as I mentioned to you earlier on in the past, that if you're sitting down, your bottom is flattened out by the weight of your body. And that's true. We took a man and we placed him on a plate of glass. And if you look for underneath that plate and looking up at him, you see that his back is flattened. The upper portion of his back is flattened, and to the middle portion. And also his buttocks is flattened, and so forth. So what we have is skin and fat, and also muscle but mainly skin and fat that we have that flattens the body out. And if you walked into autopsy rooms with me, you'd find all the bodies are flattened out. So through gravity, we see that the normal position, the normal, let's say, anatomy of a person's back is flattened out as opposed to being upright. So basically, if a man is upright, his hair falls down to his shoulders. That's what happens. If a man or a woman, and if somebody's lying down, the form is lost. But we don't see the form lost in the back of the man of the shroud. His form is intact as that of an upright man. So
Doctor, just let me. You only have about 4 minutes left, and I want to get some other thoughts from you. So what you're saying is, help me understand, make sure I'm understanding correctly for our listeners, is that the transfer of the image, if it's happening when he was lifted up, as if in midair, during the resurrection, this is happening? The image is being transferred?
Yeah, what the creator of this image wants you to know that he's lifted up. That's exactly right.
Wow. Let me ask you, we have about 4 minutes left. In terms of, you were a skeptic in the beginning. What has this done in terms of your faith and your understanding of the power of Jesus Christ in our lives, do you think?
Well, I didn't need the shroud for my
right.
faith at all, because I had my faith. So I was, like I said, a major skeptic. But now I find that this event and understanding it has deepened my faith, because I'm seeing in the real world a true miracle, just like when Jesus went to Cana, the marriage of Cana, and changed water to wine. Jesus, God, can create in seconds. You don't need anything; He just does it. And what we have here is the image, His image, lifted up, as if lifted up in midair. And we find this in the Gospel of John. In fact, I didn't know what to do with this lifted man. I had no idea. So I went to all the Gospels, and I couldn't find anything except in the Gospel of John. Jesus said, chapter 12, verse 32, "And I, when I am lifted up above the earth, will draw people to myself." That was a definite definition of exactly what I was looking at. And then I had to learn more about that, because they talked about his being on the cross. However, I found out that being lifted up in the Gospel of John, when Jesus talks about that and raised up, we find that he is talking about his lifted up in crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension to the Father. It's part of the hour of glory. Jesus and Jesus tells us that this is going to happen. He predicts this event. In fact, in the temple of Jerusalem, Jesus, when he's cleansing the temple, he says to everyone, just stop making my Father's house a marketplace. And so the Jews were not. I thought they were all my life that they were upset because he was disturbing the economy of the situation, but that was not it. What they were really upset about was that he called it my Father's house. He was calling himself the Son of God, and they asked him for a sign, and so he gave them a sign, and he said the sign that they could see. Okay, they wanted to show it and see it, and he said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." And John makes it very clear that he's talking about the temple of his body. So that's what we see, the destroyed temple of Jesus' body raised up. And that tells us what they want. That gives them the answer to their question. What right do you have to say that you are the Son of God? And he shows them the sign that they want, that he is raised up, and you see that on his cloth. So that cloth tells us that Jesus is the Son of God.
Wow. Yeah. I wish that they would expose it more. Of course, not that I have anything to say about it, but I just think it's so important for people to experience this and to see the shroud. When you see it in person, it just makes such an impression on you. And I do believe, Doctor, that the Lord leaves us these things here and there, these little miracles, to say, okay, you have doubts, come and see. I am the risen Son of God. I did rise from the dead. The resurrection is everything. Our faith wouldn't be our faith without the resurrection. And this to me, I believe is proof, and I believe you believe the same thing, correct?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about it. The whole world ought to know about this. It's about the raised man of the shroud. There it is. I mean, God is communicating to us through his Son's shroud, and basically the upright man of the shroud, the lifted man, tells us that God's plan of salvation exists in our own world of space and time. And it confirms that God's plan of salvation has been completed through his hour of glory.
Thank you, Doctor, for your time and for the detail. I can't believe this 45 minutes went by so quickly. Check out a beautiful website of Dr. Lavoie and his book, shroudstudies.org. The book is The Shroud of Jesus and the Sign John Ingeniously Concealed. Of course, the exhibit at the Shrine in D.C. runs until May 24th. There's a permanent one at Ave Maria University down in Florida. We'll be right back. Hope you enjoyed the extensive interview that we just had with Dr. Lavoie. Just fascinating in terms of the detail of the shroud. And there have been many experts who have weighed in, and many experts who, a little bit like Dr. Lavoie, he didn't pay too much attention to it, as you heard, the Shroud of Turin. But then later on, looking at the detail of it and really looking even more closely, came to believe, again, that the shroud is the burial cloth of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. All right, so we continue the conversation in the second hour on EWTN's Radio Extra with the one, the only, Father Robert Spitzer. Now, I would highly recommend you go to theshroudexperience.com. This is an immersive museum all about the Shroud of Turin. And it's put on by the Roman Catholic Diocese of Orange, as well as some local production companies. It really is an immersive experience. Just going to the website is amazing. I mean, there's so much information on the website. So if you are going to be in California, Orange, California, or anywhere near the area, I definitely would think about, I wish I could go. Seriously, I want to see this. I definitely think about going because it's incredible. And even if you just go to the newsroom, the Shroud of Turin is a blood-stained linen cloth that bears the image of a crucified man. Many people believe this man is Jesus of Nazareth, and the cloth is the burial sheet mentioned in the Gospels. Others are skeptical. Some don't know what to think. Who is the man of the shroud? Come and decide for yourself. The Shroud of Turin, an immersive experience, is located on the second floor of the Richard H. Pickup Cultural Center at Christ Cathedral in Garden Grove, California. The museum-quality buildings, designed by architect Richard Meyer, houses an epic encounter with Jesus through the Shroud of Turin. And we take you there next with the one, the only, Father Robert Spitzer. Stay tuned on a Thursday.
Welcome to Catholic Connection with Teresa Tomeo, keeping you connected to your faith and your world. Teresa tackles the issues of faith and culture, the pro-life message, and media awareness. And now, here's Teresa Tomeo.
Okay, here we go. Hour number 2 of Catholic Connection here on EWTN Radio Extra. It is a Thursday morning, April 23rd, in the third week of Easter. Great to be with you. And I know if you're a regular, even semi-regular listener of EWTN, you're familiar with the amazing Father Robert Spitzer. So much to say about him in terms of his books, in terms of his teaching, his orthodoxy, and quite frankly, his brilliance. He is very, very gifted in terms of a very high level of intelligence. And every time I interview him, I'm in awe, because he is using these gifts that he has to make a difference, to spread the faith, and especially to help people never, ever, ever give up hope. In terms of the Shroud of Turin, I think this is one of the reasons, and he'll talk to us about this, why he wants people to understand what this is. Because if this is another sign that Jesus left us, and the church leaves it open, says you don't have to believe it is the authentic burial cloth, but come and see. Now, just a little background. The reason I am so interested in it is that Deacon Dom and I, through tours that we've done with Steve Ray, co-hosting with Steve Ray, when the shroud was made available for veneration and exhibit in Torino, Italy, it is housed at St. John the Baptist Church, the same place where St. Pier Giorgio Frassati is buried. Deacon Dom and I had the chance to see it twice. There were 2 expositions in the last 25 years, and we were at both. And I believed that it was the burial cloth of Jesus before we saw it, and once I saw it, there was just no doubt in my mind, and the same with my husband, Deacon Dom. So again, I really want you to visit this website, theshroudexperience.com, because there's so much information in general about the shroud on the website, but it also gives you an idea on how you can too go deeper. Go to the gospel, see what it says about the burial cloths of Christ, how he was buried, where he was buried, what happened. And then go to this website, theshroudexperience.com, and think about, again, visiting this beautiful, beautiful museum in Orange, California. And a little bit closer, as we mentioned, there is still an exhibit taking place in Washington at the JP2 Center. So Dr. LaJoie's exhibit, and the exhibit which he is connected, is in Washington, and Father Robert Spitzer's in Orange, California. Both brilliant men, both faithful Catholics, and both have a heart to help us understand more deeply about the significance of something known as the Shroud of Turin. So we're going to dive into this with Father Spitzer. But first, before that, we have to, of course, give you the news and the weather. So we thought we would give you a little bit of information and see what's happening weather-wise. Conditions are pretty much the same as they were yesterday. There is going to be some heavy snow for the higher elevations of the northern Rockies, and that's going to continue at least to tomorrow. And then we have thunderstorm chances returning to portions of the upper Midwest and the central southern plains. That's today, with severe weather and isolated flash flooding. We also have gusty winds and warm, very dry conditions, leading to a critical risk of fire across much of the high plains. That was yesterday, but also they're saying it's going to continue into today. So there's the weather for you, and we gave you our rundown. The amazing Father Robert Spitzer. We're going to re-air the interview we did with him a few weeks ago when he was in town, headquarters of EWTN in Irondale, doing some interviews. He interviewed with Father Mitch and also Doug Keck. But right now, though, on a Thursday, we need to check the news on EWTN's Radio Extra. Iran attacking 3 ships in the Strait of Hormuz. It comes after the president announced an extension of the ceasefire earlier this week and said it was so Iran's leaders can come to the U.S. with a unified proposal. It's also after U.S. forces seized an Iranian ship and boarded the oil tanker. Unclear if a second round of in-person peace talks will happen after the president or vice president, J.D. Vance, stayed in Washington instead of heading to Pakistan yesterday. And Pope Leo on Wednesday urging Catholics in Central Africa to help shape the nation's future, saying there is a need for Christians to take the destiny of Equatorial Guinea into their own hands. The second day of the Holy Father's apostolic journey in the country, opening with the celebration of Mass at the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception in Mongomo. The Immaculate Virgin Mary is patroness of that area. The basilica, by the way, is the largest religious building in Central Africa and the second largest basilica on the continent. Equatorial Guinea is his final stop of his 10-day trip that began in Algeria and included stops in Cameroon and Angola. After a ceremony at Malbalo International Airport, he is set to depart for Rome later this evening and landing at Fiumicino International Airport. Israeli defense forces are helping a Catholic village in southern Lebanon replace a crucifix that one of its soldiers destroyed with a sledgehammer and punish 2 soldiers who took part in that desecration. EWTNnews.com reporting the Israeli military announcing in a recent post on X, in full coordination, they said, with the local community in southern Lebanon, the damaged statue was replaced by IDF troops. They added that the Northern Command did work to coordinate the replacement of the statue from the moment it received the report of the incident, and added the IDF expresses deep regret over the incident and is working to ensure it does not happen again in the future. The response, as EWTN News explains, comes after a photo circulated on social media showing an Israeli soldier striking the face of Christ on a damaged crucifix with a sledgehammer. Cardinal Pier Battista Pizzaballa, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, calling the act a grave affront to the Christian faith. A new automation system for the telescope at the Holy See's Astronomical Observatory in Arizona will allow students from Jesuit universities to use it remotely for scientific research. EWTN News explaining Mount Graham in Arizona is home to the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, one of the most important observatories managed by the Vatican. Astronomers will now be able to operate the telescope remotely without the need to be physically present on the mountain. In fact, astronomers in the Vatican Observatory at Castel Gandolfo in Italy are already making use of the new feature. And a Texas law that requires public schools to post the Ten Commandments has now been upheld by a federal court. That happened earlier this week, and the reactions are still coming in. A victory for conservative activists who feel the Bible verse should be part of curriculum.
Acknowledging the historical foundations of our laws is not only permissible, it is fully consistent with the Constitution.
And Jonathan signs with the group Texas Values, saying the ruling clears the way for donated posters to be hung in all classrooms. In its opinion released earlier this week, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals saying the state law does not punish anyone who rejects the Ten Commandments, regardless of the reason. And Roy O'Neill tells us if you're not happy with Congress, well, you're not alone.
Acknowledging the historical foundations of our laws is not only permissible, it is fully consistent with the Constitution.
A new report showing rampant sexual misconduct, meanwhile, taking place in politics. The National Women's Defense League earlier this week releasing its first ever comprehensive report on sexual misconduct in Congress, showing over the last 20 years, 49 members of Congress have been accused of some form of sexual misconduct, including 30 who are accused of workplace sexual harassment. Mark Mayfield tells us Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum is now calling for answers after reports that 2 American CIA officers died in a car accident coming back from a counter-narcotics operation in her country.
The Washington Post was the first to report the crash in northern Chihuahua State that also killed 2 Mexican officials. Reports say the CIA officers were working with Mexican officials to dismantle a drug lab. Sheinbaum said her office was unaware of the collaboration, and Mexican prosecutors are investigating whether the operation violated national security. I'm Mark Mayfield.
President Trump's pick to be the next Federal Reserve chair says he'd be strictly independent on monetary policy if he's confirmed to that post. Tori Waterman explains that Kevin Warsh made the comment during a testy Senate Banking Committee hearing on Tuesday.
Senator Elizabeth Warren called Warsh President Trump's chosen sock puppet, claiming he's flipped on being an inflation hawk to appeal to Trump. Hanging over Warsh's nomination is the DOJ's criminal investigation into the current Fed chair, Jerome Powell.
Republican Tom Tillis, who sits on the Senate Banking Committee, meanwhile, has said he will block attempts to confirm a new Fed chair until that investigation into Powell's handling of renovations at the Federal Reserve headquarters is dropped. Warsh was a member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors from 2006 to 2011, must get a majority yes vote in the committee before his confirmation goes to the full Senate. Florida's Attorney General is launching a criminal investigation into OpenAI. James Uthmeyer said his office is also issuing subpoenas to the AI company to seek information on how it approaches a user's threat of harm to themselves or others. The subpoena will also request information on policies and internal training materials regarding OpenAI's cooperation with law enforcement. And we have another story for you that's rather interesting. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has filed a lawsuit against the Open Stories Foundation over its Mormon Stories podcast.
The church alleges trademark and copyright violations, claiming the use of the word Mormon along with similar branding and design elements could confuse the public into thinking the podcast is officially affiliated. The suit also names podcast creator John P. DeLynn. He disputes the claims, saying he's used the name for more than 20 years and has made changes to address concerns. DeLynn also argues the podcast clearly states it is not affiliated with the church as the case moves forward. I'm Jim Roop.
JFK Airport is unveiling its updated Terminal 8 as it makes plans for more renovations. A Port Authority President, Catherine Garcia, helping to cut the ribbon this week on 60 new food and retail options to choose from following Terminal 8's $525 million makeover. But she says there's more to be done to improve the airport's reputation.
Ranked by many travel organizations as the worst in the country. And they were not wrong.
The airport is also allocating $9.5 billion to overhaul Terminal 1 and more than $4 billion to redo Terminal 6. There's also another $4 billion going toward infrastructure projects to address road work in the area. And dry conditions and gusty winds are triggering dozens of wildfires across Georgia. The Georgia Forestry Commission saying they've responded to nearly 100 wildfires since Saturday, and that several are still burning. The Pineland Road Fire in southern Georgia has burned over 16,000 acres and is only 10% contained. State emergency officials have issued mandatory evacuations for many living in the area. And Mark Mayfield explains rare literary classics from the likes of John Keats, James Joyce, and others are back home to their rightful owners on New York's Long Island.
17 books were stolen from the Green Tree Estate in Manhasset between 1982 and 1989. The books were returned this week to the heirs of John Hay Whitney and Betsy Whitney after someone tried to sell them to a pair of Manhattan dealers earlier this year. The rare collection is valued at an estimated $3 million. I'm Mark Mayfield.
And finally in our news on a Thursday, April 23rd, Walt Disney World raising ticket prices. The Florida theme park rolling out its pricing through October of next year. And the most expensive one-day ticket will cost $219 a person on President Day weekend. Peak ticket prices this year reaching $209. Out west, Disneyland's peak ticket has reached $224. Disney offering some discounts to try to draw visitors during the summer months, but with stripped-back perks. It is a Thursday morning. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be right back. Read you the really cool story in the update on the Holy Father's trip in the world of St. Augustine, right? In Algeria. Walking through, imagine this, the ruins of churches where Augustine lived and taught and preached. Can you imagine what that means for the Pope? First of all, being the Pope and the Vicar of Christ, and then walking in the footsteps of such a great teacher. And also because Pope Leo is of the Augustinian order. He's an Augustinian and, of course, loves St. Augustine, and so do I. And when we see these things, and when we see the Holy Father going to a particular place, that means it must be important. Because there's a gazillion places to which the Vicar of Christ is invited by so many people, but how they choose these trips say a lot. And so I believe the Holy Father is not only going there for his own encouragement, which I'm sure it does, being in such a historic and importantly Catholic place, but it's an opportunity for us to say, you know what, I haven't really, maybe you have, but if you have and want to kind of refresh your knowledge of St. Augustine, maybe it's time to do that. Or if you really don't know much about St. Augustine of Hippo, maybe it's time to find out more about him. So here's a little background. Then I want to share with you, Late Have I Loved You, his prayer. Beauty so ancient and so new. I absolutely love it. And St. Augustine, by the way, even though he was brilliant, early church father, theologian, philosopher, bishop, writings profoundly shaping Western Christianity and philosophy, he was a human being, and he struggled with many of the same things and temptations with which we all struggle. And that's why I think, especially in this day and age, we were talking with the good Bishop Burbidge and Dr. Michael Horn from the Diocese of Arlington earlier in the first hour of Catholic Connection today. Many of the things with which we struggle come to us in different forms because of the expansive amount of media we're exposed to regularly. But they're the same issues. The same issues. As it says in Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament, nothing new under the sun. If we have time, I also want to talk a little bit about the surrender of St. Francis in terms of another person who lived a very worldly lifestyle before totally submitting to the Lord. So St. Augustine of Hippo, 354, 430 AD, that's when he lived and walked the earth. Again, a theologian, philosopher, and bishop. His writings profoundly shaped Western Christianity and philosophy, as I just mentioned. He was born, again, in 354 AD in modern-day Algeria to a pagan father and, of course, a devout Christian mom, St. Monica. And from an early age, he displayed remarkable intelligence, especially in rhetoric, and was enrolled as a catechumen by his mom. Though his baptism was deferred, he pursued studies in a number of places, and he became deeply engaged in secular learning and the pursuit of worldly success. And during his youth, he explored a number of different religions, which reflected really his search for truth and wisdom. Now, as a young man, he led a life marked by sensual indulgence and moral experimentation. He famously recounted acts of youthful mischief, such as stealing pears, which he later interpreted as manifestations of pride and disordered desire. At 19, reading Cicero, it inspired a passionate pursuit of truth and philosophical investigation. He then had a son out of wedlock, and his early career included teaching rhetoric in Carthage, Rome, and Milan. Now, his conversion was very gradual. I mean, his mom, Monica, and you know St. Monica, she prayed for him for 20 years? And eventually those prayers started to take root. So her prayers and her guidance, along with the preaching of Bishop Ambrose of Milan, he had a profound spiritual awakening and was baptized at the age of 33. So this is a perfect example of how it's never too late, right? Now, this marked the beginning of his lifelong commitment to God, including celibacy and service to the church. In 396, he became the Bishop of Hippo, a position he held until his death in 430 AD. As bishop, he was a skilled preacher, theologian, administrator, addressing both pastoral and doctrinal challenges. He formulated key teachings, including the concept of original sin, and contributed to the development of the just war theory, which would be something really important, especially right now, to revisit in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. To give you kind of a Catholic perspective, and we're going to discuss this with Father Mitch later in the week, about what does a just war mean? What does the Church say about this? He also defended Christianity during the decline of the Western Roman Empire, conceptualizing the Church as a spiritual city of God, distinct from the earthly city. Now, he was a prolific writer, including over 5 million words of surviving texts. 5 million words. Of course, major works include the Confessions, the City of God, on Christian doctrine and on the Trinity. Of course, for we Catholics, he's recognized as one of our greatest teachers and fathers of the Church, a doctor of the Church. He's also venerated in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Lutheran Church, and in the Anglican traditions. He was masterful at integrating classical philosophy with Christian theology, and it laid the groundwork for medieval scholasticism and influenced modern Christian thought. What I love about Augustine is he never stopped challenging himself. His life was marked by, as this summary says, intellectual searching, moral struggles, and spiritual transformation, and remains a model of conversion and theological insight. Look, there are very, very few saints. There are some that were born basically with this spiritual spoon in their mouth, in terms of when they came out of the womb, they were holy. Obviously, they were born with original sin, but that they lived this life of spiritual perfection. I would say the vast majority of our 10,000 plus states in the Catholic Church, that was not them. They struggled, they grew, they were challenged, they suffered. And that's why it's really great for us to look at a saint like Augustine, who is one of the most profound teachers of our faith. And yet he too struggled with some very, very basic things, especially including pride and lust. So I thought I would close. I don't have time to go into St. Francis, maybe later in the week. But because we're in the land of Augustine with the Holy Father, I thought I would close with one of my favorite prayers. And by the way, Matt Maher has a really cool song on this, and it's called Late Have I Loved You. And this is St. Augustine, talking about his own slowness in coming to Christ. But the thing is, God doesn't waste his time, brothers and sisters. Every little bit of time Augustine spent wandering and researching and teaching, and also being challenged by sin, made him a better bishop and a better teacher, because he knows what we're going through. Late have I loved you, beauty so ancient, so new. Late have I loved you. You were within me, but I was outside you, and there I searched for you. In my unloveliness I plunged into the lovely things which you created. You were with me, but I was not with you. Created things kept me from you. Yet if they had not been in you, they would not have been at all. You called, you shouted, you broke through my deafness. You flashed, you shone, you dispelled my blindness. You breathed your fragrance on me. I drew in breath, and now I long for you. I have tasted you. Now I hunger and thirst for more. You touched me, and I burned for your peace. Written by the one, the only, St. Augustine of Hippo. A great teacher for us. So when you see the Holy Father going to these types of very important places in history and Catholicism, don't just say, oh, that's interesting. It is, but look into it. You'll be amazed at what you learn about these places, and especially about our saints. We'll be right back. Well, I can't tell you how excited I am to have Father Robert Spitzer, president of the Magis Center of Reason and Faith. And of course, you know him well from our many programs at EWTN, including Father Spitzer's Universe. He is in town to do a number of different tapings and broadcasts, and he's going to do a lot of promos for us, and he's going to be with Johnnette Williams and, of course, Doug Keck, as I mentioned, for Father Spitzer's Universe, and he's going to be interviewed by the one, the only, of course, a fellow Jesuit, Father Mitch Pacwa. They have got you running around like crazy, Father.
Yeah, they do.
Good morning.
Good morning, Teresa. Yes, they do, but it's great. It makes the whole trip doubly worthwhile. So, and of course, whatever matters in the kingdom of God and whatever ways we might be able to enhance it makes life worth living in the best possible way.
Amen. I'm so glad that they're grabbing as much of you as possible, because we need people to hear what you have to say. So happy Easter, first of all. And secondly, so excited to talk to you about the Shroud and the Immersive Shrine of Turin Museum in Orange, California. This is so exciting, Father, right?
Absolutely. This museum is par excellence. It really has, like I would say, three-dimensional kinds of imaging, all kinds of slideshows and moving films through three different rooms that you go through. I myself did the science part. There's an exhibit just concerned with the science behind the Shroud of Turin, which I was responsible for mostly, and then on top of it, we've got all kinds of things like the VP8 image analyzer, the big three-dimensional bronze statue, of the body of Jesus based on the three-dimensional imaging on the Shroud of Turin, and many, many other things. It's truly immersive. Truly helps people to enter into both the tomb, enter into, what happened to Jesus beforehand, what happened during the Passion, and allowing the anatomical evidence on the shroud to kind of be writ large, to kind of emerge, as elucidating the gospel narratives and showing how right on, spot on those gospel passion narratives, and, by the way, the gospel resurrection narratives are, because the science of the Shroud of Turin actually shows the strong likelihood and the preponderance of evidence for an intense burst of particle radiation for 1/10,000th of a second involving 2 times 10 to the 18th neutrons, protons, and deuterons, which is about 1/10 billionth of the particles in the shroud man's body, who, of course, I consider to be Jesus Christ.
Wow.
And that effusion of particles requires fissioning, but there's no natural source of fissioning anywhere in a tomb or in a cloth or in a body. So explain that one without God, probably very difficult indeed. And then, of course, the body has to disappear because the bloodstains are transferred from mostly dried condition on the body. They got to be transplanted totally onto the shroud from a dry condition. That can only happen with radiation pressure produced by the same particle radiation. And because of that, once this particle radiation has pushed the bloodstains onto the shroud, with perfection. The edges of the bloodstains are even intact. No segmenting.
Well, the facial image is amazing to me. Unbelievable. Yeah.
Unbelievable. Yeah. It's a perfect three-dimensional photographic negative image. You can use a VP8 image analyzer to create a three-dimensional face, which, of course, is now memorialized in those bronze statues that are there in the Immersive Shroud experience in Orange County.
Father, let me ask you, when did you first take an interest in the shroud and to the point where you wanted to really study it?
Well, I was in the novitiate, and this is a long time ago, so I'm in the novitiate in 1974, And this friend of mine, Kevin Griffin, who was with me there, he says, "You just got to read this book by Pierre Barbet called The Doctor at Calvary." I said, "No kidding. I really haven't thought about it." So I grabbed the book, and it was actually a good anatomical study from a really first-class medical doctor. And he goes through, the blood and the image evidence on the shroud, indicating the veracity of the gospel narratives on the Passion. So I thought, this is totally amazing. Once gripped by that, and I was gripped by the science, I must admit, and the medicine and the anatomical evidence, but when I got a hold of that, I just couldn't stop. I kept going forward. I experienced a little, digression, when the 1988 carbon dating came out.
Right, carbon dating came out.
Yeah, I felt like, well, these guys couldn't have lied. I mean, it has to be in the raw data of the carbon dating. So I thought for a while, well, maybe that's correct, and maybe I've been deluded, and Pierre Barbet was deluded, and John Jackson was deluded, and then I began to think to myself, wait a minute, there's about 15 really good physicists that were really deluded, and all the doctors who examined it, and all the...
Well, not only that, but how do you explain, how did the image get there in terms of, it just doesn't make sense that it would be
it has
miraculous.
to have a supernatural origin.
Right.
Like I said, you're going to need an intense burst of radiation, only for 1/10,000th of a second, that's true. But you're going to get a lot of protons, deuterons, and neutrons. The protons and deuterons are what created the image, and of course, how are you going to get the fissioning necessary to create a low-temperature nuclear reaction in the body? That has to be supernatural causation, namely God. And then, of course, the neutrons themselves are what threw off the carbon dating, because linen cloths are made of cellulose. Cellulose has a lot of natural element N13, nitrogen 13 in it, but has also a lot of N14 isotope in it. So, when you add, there's a little typical formula here, that N14 plus a neutron yields C14 plus a proton. Well, what's measured in a carbon-14 dating test is carbon-14. Yet we can see that if you add one simple neutron to N14, you're going to get carbon-14 in abundance on that cloth. So what's going to happen is you're going to have the mass density of carbon-14 is going to be very, very high, close to the body. And then where the sample was taken, right, there's an 8-centimeter sample that was taken from the shroud in the foot area at the very edge of the cloth, on the right side of the cloth. Now, when you remove that piece, you divide it into 12 subsections, and of course you have the 3 laboratories looking at the carbon dating. The date that's closest to the body is 1410. The date that's furthest, right at the edge of the shroud, furthest from the body, is 1150. How in the world can you get a 250-year variance in an 8-centimeter cloth? That's like 31, actually closer to 32 years per centimeter. And it is systematic. So, as I said, you move away, another centimeter, you're going to get another less, 31 years, or if you're going closer to the body, more 31 years. So, of course, Monte Carlo end particle software predicts if you had a particle effusion of 2 times 10 to the 18th neutrons coming from the body, which is what the physicists who have examined it think that it was. If you have that effusion coming from the body and you use the Monte Carlo end particle software, it can actually give you the density of the neutrons, the density of the extra carbon-14 that would be created by that neutron effusion, and you then use that Monte Carlo end particle software. It corresponds exactly to what the carbon dating was. It was a systematic error from the very beginning, Teresa.
Right.
But it was covered over by Damon, who published the data. They basically did a very unusual method for establishing the margin of error. But essentially, if you have more than 2 standard deviations from the mean, deviation from the mean in the sample, I mean, it's obviously there's a glaring systematic error somewhere, and that was covered over. But when Tristan Casabianca and his team, publishing at Oxford's, Archaeometry, very well-known journal.
Father, hold that thought.
Okay.
We have many more questions to ask you, and we'll follow up right after the break. We're talking to the amazing Father Robert Spitzer, who's in studio with us this morning. He'll be on Father Mitch's program tonight, talking about the Immersive Shroud of Turin, a museum now open in the Diocese of Orange. We'll be right back. I'll tell you what, I could talk about this forever, especially with our wonderful guest, our dear, dear friend and partner here at EWTN, the amazing Father Robert Spitzer. He is in town. He's in Irondale, sitting in the studio with my wonderful producer, Richard, of course, in the Alabama area. And we're talking the Shroud of Turin. More specifically, we're talking about this fantastic museum that opened late last year in the Diocese of Orange. You have to check it out. Father, the website is beautiful. It's just wonderful. There's a nice promotional video that people can watch. And you're going to be with Father Mitch tonight. You're taping Father Spitzer's Universe. You're going to be with Jonette Williams. You're going to be doing some radio promos. I don't want you to work too hard, but at the same time, I'm glad that they are basically using you up because because we want to tap into that huge brain of yours. So
your producer said, "Ring me out."
Yeah. But you know what, though? I mean, there'll still be so much left over because you're so intelligent and have so much to bring us. Thank you for your dedication to this. To me, what is so powerful is that our Lord says, "Come and see." Mm-hmm. It's there, and yet so many people. I don't know what it is, because maybe they're afraid to study it, because if they study it and take a closer look at it, then they'll have to believe, because how else do you explain this? What do you think?
I think that is very true. I think there are a lot of people who use very haphazard, non-systematic, and non-scientific criticisms to try and, as it were, not study the shroud. I mean, but most of these things are easily proven to be false allegations. There's one guy who tries a contact method of reproducing the image and says, see, if you try contact method, it won't work. This does not prove the invalidity of the shroud. It proves that the contact method was not the method by which the image was transferred onto the cloth. Rather, radiation is what was the cause of it. And there's a very detailed explanation of that, which you can prove over and over and over again. So, I mean, the whole idea of people making contact images to disprove the shroud, or somebody sponging some blood-like substance, putting it on a sponge, and then putting it onto a mannequin and saying, see, it doesn't drip like the Shroud of Turin. Well, first of all, how about using some real blood? And second of all, how about doing this scientifically so that it actually replicates the conditions under which the blood was flowing from a real body, not, fake blood sponged onto a mannequin. I mean, it's just unbelievable the attempts that have been made by the critics, but they're laughable. I mean, they literally are so unscientific that they're laughable. But I do agree with you. I think a lot of people, they don't want to see the real evidence, because if you see this, not just the evidence for the blood stains. I mean, when you have a guy like Macron basically saying, well, these are not blood, these are paint stains or ochre stains, they are certainly not anything of the kind. These blood stains contain AB blood type, right? I mean, ochre, paint don't have a blood type.
Right.
And of course, how about human immunoglobulins? How about human hemoglobin?
And even if it were a paint job, how do you get that kind of image? Given that they've dated now and how old the shroud is, and they've proven the time frame of the shroud. Father, let me ask you also, because one thing, and I've had the opportunity to go to the Shroud of Turin, where it's located at St. John the Baptist, and see it twice, and it'll just blow you away. But the church very rarely exposes it for veneration. There's been twice in the last 25, 30 years. And I'm wondering, sometimes I want them to say, put a big marquee, shroud here, take a look at Jesus, come on. To say, this is so incredible. So why are we so subtle about it, do you think, in terms of very gently saying, come and see? It is housed in St. John the Baptist in Torino, but it's not open for or exposed for veneration right now. It has been in the past, twice in the last 25 years. But in terms of being able to control the setting so it's not damaged in any way from light, why don't you think they do it more often? I just wonder.
I think there's three parties that have to be satisfied, right? There's the Commission in Turin, not easily satisfied. There's the Catholic Church, who, of course, worries about, the consistency, efficacy, and durability of the shroud under not just test conditions, but just in an exhibition where ultraviolet light is going to make contact with it inevitably. Now, of course, it's the carbonyl bonds in the shroud are guaranteed that it has a lot of crystalline carbonyl bonds, and that was produced by the neutron flow that I just talked about. But the main thing is it makes the shroud very durable. So I do think they could put it on, but of course, if you don't subscribe to, this durability hypothesis, and, it rides on you. And, of course, there's finally the whole thing of if the church keeps displaying it, maybe that it looks like unofficially the church is approving it. But, I mean, the church doesn't have to make an approval of it. If they're uncomfortable with it, let the science speak for itself. I mean, I think the science speaks for it so powerfully. A church approval would be nice. It would help.
Well, because they have so many other wonderful church approvals for other miracles, such as the Eucharistic miracles, Lanciano, for example, Lanciano, right? And the so many Eucharistic miracles around the world that have been confirmed, not to mention all the saints that or the people that have become saints. Those are miracles that have to be affirmed and tested greatly. So I just wondered why they haven't said, yes, this is the Shroud of Jesus yet.
I just think because there's still controversy surrounding it, and they just want to be 100% sure. I think there is a way of becoming 100% sure in the next exhibition. There's two methods. The first is to look for cosmogenic isotopes in the shroud, and that would indicate that it had been around a low-temperature nuclear reaction. And, of course, again, there you have the problem, of the fissioning. Where did you get the supernatural causation for that? And of course, you're going to need God as an explanation. But if we identify, for example, chlorine 36 or calcium 41 in the shroud in some abundance, right? The shroud has natural chlorine, but the isotope chlorine 36 is a very rare cosmogenic isotope. However, it increases vastly in frequency when it's around a low temperature nuclear reaction. So we could just tell that the body was undergoing fissioning right there with an abundance of Cl36. Also with calcium 41, tombstones. Tombs are made of calcium, right? And so the interior calcium that's there in the limestone, if you got an abundance of it turning into Ca41, right? This isotope, right? It has extra neutron in it. Then there were neutrons bouncing around in there from a low temperature nuclear reaction that came from the body. Well, I got to tell you, that's just so unusual. And by the way, we could even validate from that. We could validate the fact that the sacred place, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, whether that was actually the place. Because if we find that Ca41 there, then that shroud with that radioactive body, even though it only lasted 1/10,000th of a second, will be perfectly evident. And by the way, we could also do additional carbon datings on that shroud.
A few years ago, and excuse me for interrupting, I forgot to mention the website, Father, of the museum. It's so important, theshroudexperience.com, theshroudexperience.com. It has the location, how to visit, tickets, all that information, a beautiful promotional video featuring our guest, Father Robert Spitzer. But go to theshroudexperience.com. What's also fascinating were the pollen that they found, right?
Yes.
Of flowers that only bloom in and around Jerusalem in the springtime.
Yes, exactly. There are 13 pollens as well as the flowers that you mentioned, and these have been validated by many palynologists, and so you can be sure that those flowers came and were indigenous to and unique to the area of northern Judea and Jerusalem. In addition to that, there are 13 pollen grains that are unique, indigenous to that region, and 3 of them have never been found outside of Jerusalem except on the Shroud of Turin. So, pretty much the shroud had to be there in the open air for at least 2 to 3 centuries to get 3/4 of the pollen grains come from that area. You're going to have a long-standing presence there. Now, that would immediately undermine the carbon dating. If the shroud is only 700 years old, then it could have only been in Liry, France, and Turin, Italy. That's it, basically, in Europe, because, of course, we have an established provenance of the shroud from 1350 onward in France and all the way into Italy, where it has remained to this very day. Now, the one thing that's important to note is, but wait a minute, if it had to be in Jerusalem for at least 3 centuries in order to get the accumulation, the 3/4 of the pollen grains that are there indigenous to that region, well, that would make the shroud automatically 700 plus 300 years old, 1,000 years old, throwing the carbon dating already off. And then we find indigenous pollens to Edessa, Turkey, and indigenous pollens to Constantinople, Turkey, that indicate this was the second most, prominent, second and third most prominent regions that the shroud is in, after Jerusalem and northern Judea, and then it comes to France and Turin, Italy. So for all intents and purposes, that dating couldn't possibly be right on a whole series of levels, not to mention a wide-angle X-ray scattering device, which is a peer-reviewed, excellent dating method that was done by Dr. Liberato Di Caro and his team at Italian National Labs, dating the shroud to between 54 to 75 AD. That's well within, acceptable margins of errors, like well within, 100 years of acceptable margin of error. So when people go, well, it's not 33 AD, it's only 54 AD. Well, 20 years can get lost a whole lot because, of course, carbon exigencies and a variety of carbon distributions, the absorption properties of the linen cloth. 20 years is a big nothing burger. I mean, 54 AD is mid-1st century, and I'm telling you, this is confirmed also by 3 tests that were done by Giulio Fanti, Dr. Giulio Fanti, also at Italian National Labs, and he indicated from a Fourier transformed infrared spectroscopy, a Raman laser spectroscopy, mechanical tension and compressibility tests, that the average weighted score of that is 90 AD, close to the mid-1st century, again, well within acceptable margin of error. This cloth comes from the mid-1st century, no question about it, and the pollen grains confirm it. The correlations with the face cloth of Oviedo confirm it. And so,
Well, the face cloth, and then the pictures in the pictures, the paintings, Father, from that came, if the way you describe on the website, which is very, very important, when you compare the image of our Lord's face in the shroud to the early images of Jesus, especially that famous image of Jesus, a teacher.
Yeah, exactly. And that image comes from what was thought to be the Mandylion, which was present there in Edessa, Turkey. Remember, Edessa was a crossroads area, and the actual image, was folded up. So, in other words, the head was showing, but the other parts of the body, dorsal part and frontal part, were not showing because the cloth was folded up. Under ultraviolet light, we can actually see the folds that were there when the shroud was folded with the head first.
Oh my gosh!
And you compressed, right, in order to put it into the frame, and it was shown around. And as you indicated, Teresa, there are many, many enigmatic features. Before Edessa, before the Mandylion, the iconography of Jesus was decidedly Roman. The round face, the short haircut, no beard, etc. Now, all of a sudden, you get to Edessa, Turkey, everything changes. And not only does he have the elongated Semitic face, not only does he have the other Semitic features, he has the long beard that's that's basically trimmed to be Semitic in origin. The haircut, long hair, with of course the
eyes, the way the one eye looks larger than the other, and the whole
correct.
thing. Yep.
And you can see exactly where he was punched in the face.
Yep.
And his eyebrow raises up, on the right hand side, and you look. Well, wait a minute. How could the iconographers have this punch feature right on the icons? Well, the only place you're going to get that from is
from
the shroud. Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're right on the marker.
Oh, boy, Father, thank you for doing this. I wish we had 4 hours. I mean, I could talk to you. No, it's so fascinating, and it's just like God to give us this and say, you know what, just come and see. Think about this. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Beautiful, Father. Thank you so much, and looking forward to the many programs you'll be doing this week in Irondale at our headquarters in Alabama. What a gift to have you in studio with us. We'll be right back. Wow. Every time I interview Father Spitzer, it is amazing, as I said, that man's intelligence and what a gift he is to the church and to the world. So again, that beautiful immersion experience available at the museum in Orange, California. Check it out, and don't forget you also have that exhibit that's going on in Washington for a few more weeks, Washington, D.C., so worth it. It's also great, because we are in the Easter season, to revisit many of the verses which we hear during Holy Week. And that kind of, I think, will, re-spark your interest in this and give us a little bit spiritual shot in the arm. It's one of the reasons I wanted to air these interviews as we were in the third week of Easter. So today is a Thursday. Tomorrow is a Friday, April 24th, moving into the fourth week of Easter. And, of course, we are going to be featuring our very own Doug Keck. Doug was mentioned, of course, because of his work with Father Spitzer. On Fridays, he gives us the inside word. So he'll let us know what's going on in terms of events that we need to hear about, events that we're covering, and also special programming as we move through the Easter season all the way to, my goodness, Pentecost, the Ascension, just an exciting time of year, always focusing on Christ. We'll also have an update, of course, in the news about the positive fallout from the Holy Father's trip. Wow. Can you believe it's done already? It's amazing. 11 days that he spent in that part of the world in Africa, and so far his impact seems to really be reaching hearts and minds, not only just in Africa, but across the globe. Looking forward to speaking with you on a Friday. Have a great Thursday. Ciao, ciao.